Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a sealed letter or old paper resting somewhere near you tonight, its story quietly waiting? Watson always believed that paper remembers what people try to forget. Do subscribe, so no hidden truth escapes you. Now, settle in, for as Holmes once said, it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Find us always on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel, linked below. A visitor from Lincoln's Inn. It was in the early days of March, in a season when London seemed to alternate hourly between the promise of spring and the sullen relapse into winter, that I found myself once more in our old quarters at Baker Street, engaged in nothing more useful than the ordering of my own thoughts. Sherlock Holmes, who was seldom idle by choice, had fallen that week into one of those rare and curious lulls which occasionally interrupted his professional life. The newspapers lay scattered about him in a state of some disorder, their columns marked here and there with pencil, where some paragraph had briefly caught his interest and as quickly released it. A fine drift of tobacco ash had settled upon the arm of his chair, and a pile of unanswered correspondence, weighted down with a jackknife, rose upon the mantel like a small and neglected monument. "You are unusually silent this evening, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes from the ceiling, toward which he had been directing a long and contemplative stream of blue smoke. "I was thinking that you seem out of sorts for want of employment," I replied. "Employment," said he, "is not wanting in London so much as employment worthy of the name. I have had 3 letters this week. One from a lady who has mislaid a pug dog, one from a gentleman who suspects his butler of reading his newspaper before he does, and one from a bishop who wishes me to recover a snuff-box of purely sentimental value. I begin to think, my dear fellow, that the criminal classes have taken to some new form of restraint, out of consideration for my nerves." He had scarcely finished this complaint when we heard the bell ring below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice and the heavier tread of a man mounting the stair with the particular hesitation of one who has rehearsed his errand and is already regretting it. Holmes sat up with the swift, silent attention of a hound that has caught a distant scent. "A client, Watson, and one in some agitation, unless I'm very much mistaken. Listen to the man's step, firm enough on the lower stairs but faltering as he nears the door. That is not fatigue. That is a man arguing with himself." The door opened upon a gentleman of perhaps 35 years, dressed with the quiet and expensive precision of a successful solicitor. His coat was well cut, his linen spotless, his boots polished to the dull gleam that speaks of a careful valet rather than a careless one. Yet for all this outward composure his face betrayed him. It was pale beneath its usual healthy colour, and his eyes moved restlessly about the room before settling, with evident relief, upon Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must apologise for this unceremonious call. My name is Percival Harbury. I am solicitor to Sir Aldrich Vane, of Kensington." "Pray sit down, Mr. Harbury," said Holmes, indicating the basket chair before the fire. "You will forgive me if I observe that you have come to me not upon your own account but upon your employer's, and that you do so with some reluctance." Harbury started slightly. "How could you possibly? You have twice glanced toward the door since entering, as a man does who half hopes he may yet retreat unseen." "A man consulting a detective upon his own affairs generally shows anxiety mingled with a certain relief at having taken action. You show only anxiety. The relief is absent. Therefore, the decision to come here was not entirely your own, and you are uncertain of its wisdom even now." "You are quite right," said our visitor with a faint and unhappy smile. "Sir Aldrich does not know I am here. He would be most displeased, but I could not in conscience do nothing." "Then let us hear the matter, and you may leave your conscience to judge afterward whether you did rightly." Harbury drew from his breast pocket a small square of paper, much handled, and passed it to Holmes. "This arrived by the first post 3 days ago, addressed to Sir Aldrich in a hand none of us recognises. There was no signature, and the postmark was smudged beyond reading." Holmes unfolded it and held it first to the light of the window, then closer to the lamp. I rose and looked over his shoulder. Upon the paper, in a small, careful, and rather old-fashioned hand, was written a single sentence. The seal was never yours. And Sir Aldrich's response to this, Holmes inquired. He laughed at it, Mr. Holmes, called it the work of some crank or disappointed litigant, of whom, in a career upon the bench, he has naturally accumulated a few. He instructed me to burn it. I did not. You kept it against his wishes. That argues either great loyalty or great fear. Perhaps both. Tell me, Mr. Harbury, what does Sir Aldrich keep sealed, that a stranger should trouble to remind him of it? The solicitor's hand, I noticed, went briefly to his cuff, upon which I now observed a small stain of violet ink, of a common and inferior sort such as is provided in the writing-rooms of railway stations and public libraries, quite unlike the rich black fluid that would furnish the office of a Lincoln's Inn solicitor. Holmes's eyes had already found it. I am sure I do not know, said Harbury, a shade too quickly. Sir Aldrich has kept many papers in his time. He was a magistrate before his retirement, and magistrates accumulate enemies as naturally as they accumulate briefs. Come, Mr. Harbury, you have avoided a certain word throughout this interview with a care that argues design rather than accident. You have spoken of papers, of briefs, of documents, but not once of a deposition. Our visitor went very white. How did you— I did not know it, sir. I merely observed that you were determined I should not learn it from you. You have now confirmed it yourself. There was, I take it, some deposition connected with an old inquiry, which Sir Aldrich holds still under seal, and which this note suggests is not what it claims to be. Harbury said nothing, but his silence was itself an answer, and a more eloquent one than words. I think, Watson, said Holmes, turning to me with that particular light in his eye which I had long ago learned to associate with the scent of a genuine problem, that we shall pay a call upon Sir Aldrich Vane. Mr. Harbury, you need not announce us as coming upon your recommendation. Say only that Sherlock Holmes has heard the matter is one of some delicacy, and wishes to satisfy his curiosity. Sir Aldrich may refuse me. Few men do. And so it was arranged. And as our visitor took his leave, still uneasy but somewhat lightened, I confess that I felt in myself that quickening of interest which I had come, over the years, to regard as the surest sign that Holmes and I stood once more upon the threshold of a case worth the telling. Chapter 2. The House of Quiet Respectability. Sir Aldrich Vane's residence stood upon one of those broad tree-lined Kensington squares where wealth expresses itself not in ostentation, but in a kind of settled and unassailable calm. The house itself was tall and grey-fronted, with window boxes still bare against the March chill, and a brass plate beside the door so highly polished that it seemed almost an impertinence upon so modest a threshold. We were admitted by a manservant of the old school, grave and silent, who conducted us through a hall hung with legal engravings, portraits of judges in their robes, a framed writ under glass, an old parchment whose seal I could not from that distance make out, into a study that spoke eloquently of its owner's life and tastes. Sir Aldrich Vane rose to greet us from behind a desk of dark mahogany. He was a man of perhaps 65 years, spare and upright, with the clear, pale eyes and deliberate manner of one long, accustomed to weighing evidence before pronouncing judgment. His hair was white but abundant, his handshake firm, and his voice, when he spoke, carried still the measured cadence of the bench. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, examining my friend with frank curiosity. "I confess I did not expect the pleasure. Harbury tells me you have heard some foolish rumour concerning an anonymous letter." "I have heard of the letter itself, Sir Aldrich, rather than any rumour," Holmes replied, seating himself uninvited in the chair nearest the fire, a habit of his which I had long since ceased to find remarkable. "I understand you regard it as the work of a crank." "What else should I think? I sat upon the bench for 25 years, Mr. Holmes. A magistrate makes enemies as surely as a physician makes bills. Some disappointed litigant, some fellow who believes I dealt with him unjustly 40 years ago, and has at last found the courage of an anonymous pen, these things happen. I did not summon you, and I confess I see no need of your services. Then I shall not press them upon you, said Holmes pleasantly, though I hope you will permit an old habit of curiosity to look about your excellent collection while I am here. Your reputation as a connoisseur of legal antiquities is not confined to Lincoln's Inn. At this Sir Aldrich's stiffness relaxed a little, as I have observed it will in any man when his particular vanity is touched with sincerity rather than flattery. He conducted us about the room with evident pride, showing us a star-chamber writ, a set of Tudor seals under glass, and in the far corner a tall cabinet of dark oak with glass doors, within which I could see a number of documents laid upon shelves of green baize. It was at this moment that the door opened and a lady entered, young, or at least many years the junior of her husband, dressed in grey silk of excellent quality, with a face that might have been called handsome, had it not worn so fixed and careful an expression of politeness. Sir Aldrich presented her as Lady Vane. "My husband's collection amuses him more than it does me," said she, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I confess I find old papers a melancholy sort of hobby, Mr. Holmes. They smell of dead men's business. And yet, Lady Vane, the living so often depend upon what the dead once wrote," Holmes observed. She made no answer to this, but I noticed, as I think Holmes also noticed, though he gave no sign, that her glance travelled, for the briefest instant, to the oak cabinet in the corner, and that her hand tightened upon the gold chain at her throat. We were next introduced to Miss Eleanor Strake, Sir Aldrich's private secretary, who came in with a sheaf of papers requiring signature. She was perhaps 30, plainly but neatly dressed, with quick dark eyes and a manner of precision that seemed almost military in a woman of her station. When Sir Aldrich mentioned, in an offhand way, that Mr. Holmes had come in connection with an anonymous letter, I observed her hand check upon the paper she carried, so slightly that I might have missed it had I not been watching for such things in the way that years of Holmes's company had taught me. "I am sure it is nothing, Sir Aldrich," said she in a voice a shade too even. "So I have told him," replied our host with satisfaction. 2 other guests were announced before we had been in the house half an hour. The first was Mr. Giles Fenwick, an art and antiquities dealer of jovial and rather florid manner, who professed a keen interest in Sir Aldrich's collection, and spoke at some length of a bill of sale he hoped to arrange for 1 or 2 of the lesser items. Yet I noticed that his eyes, for all his jollity, returned again and again to the locked cabinet, with a scrutiny that seemed to me more professional than social. The second was Captain Maurice Lydgate, a distant relation of Sir Aldrich's, a bluff, weathered man of military bearing who explained, somewhat too readily, that he had merely called in the hope of being asked to dinner. He and Fenwick, thrown together in the same room, exchanged a greeting of such elaborate carelessness that I set it down at once as the courtesy of men who wish to appear unacquainted with each other's dislike. We did not stay above the hour. As we walked back toward the corner where a cab might be found, Holmes was silent for a time, his stick tapping the pavement in that thoughtful rhythm I had come to associate with the early stirrings of a theory not yet ready for words. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "what did you make of our visit?" "A pleasant, respectable household," said I, "though not perhaps an entirely comfortable one." "Precisely so. Did you remark that Lady Vane dislikes her husband's solicitor, though Harbury was not even present to earn it? That Fenwick studied the cabinet as a burglar studies a safe, yet spoke only of legitimate purchase? That Miss Strake, a secretary of no more than 5 years' service by her own account, uses the phrases of a woman trained in law rather than shorthand? And that Captain Lydgate, who claims to have come for his dinner, wore boots that had walked a considerable distance before ever he reached that drawing-room carpet? I had not observed the boots. Few would, But I will tell you what struck me most of all, Watson, and it is this. Every person in that house is afraid of something, and not one of them is afraid of the same thing as his neighbour, or so it appears. I begin to suspect, however, that all their separate fears have a single root, and that the root is old and buried and kept, like Sir Aldrich's precious documents, under glass and lock, in the belief that what cannot be touched cannot do harm. He said no more upon the subject that evening, but I observed that he sat late over his pipe, and that when I retired he was still turning over, in that restless and orderly mind of his, the small, disquieting harvest of our afternoon call. Chapter 3. The Locked Cabinet and the Dead Magistrate. It was 2 evenings later that a note arrived at Baker Street, written in a hand I recognised at once as Sir Aldrich Vane's own, though considerably less steady than the firm, judicial script I had admired upon the documents in his study. It requested, with a courtesy that seemed almost an apology for his earlier coolness, that Mr. Holmes should call that same evening, as Sir Aldrich found himself troubled by matters connected with our previous visit, and wished to show him something in confidence. "You will notice, Watson," said Holmes, passing me the note, "that our friend the magistrate has changed his opinion of cranks and their letters. A man does not summon a detective at 9 o'clock at night merely to indulge an idle curiosity." We arrived at the Kensington house to find it quieter than before, the drawing-room dark, most of the household apparently retired or occupied elsewhere. Sir Aldrich received us in his study, where a single lamp burned upon the desk, throwing long shadows across the ranked volumes of law reports that lined the walls. He seemed to me a changed man from the confident collector of 2 days before. There was a hollowness about his eyes, and his hand, as he gestured us to chairs, trembled very slightly. "I have thought a great deal since your visit, Mr. Holmes," said he, "and I find that a man's confidence is a more fragile thing than he supposes at 65. I should like you to examine the deposition itself, the one, I do not scruple to admit, to which that wretched letter must refer." He crossed to the oak cabinet, drew a small key from his waistcoat pocket, and unlocked the glass door. From among the papers within he withdrew a single document, folded in the old style and secured with a disc of red wax bearing an official impression. He laid it upon the desk beneath the lamp with the particular tenderness of a man handling a relic he has protected for 20 years. "This is the deposition taken at Hatherby Cross," said he, "in an inquiry over which I presided as a young magistrate. It concerns a matter long closed and best forgotten, save that someone, it seems, has not forgotten it. I give you my word, Mr. Holmes, that this document has never been altered since the day it was sealed." Holmes bent over the paper with that quick, silent attention which I had seen him give to 1,000 exhibits, criminal and otherwise, and had a lens half drawn from his pocket, when a sudden commotion in the passage without arrested us all. A housemaid's voice, raised and frightened, called for someone to come quickly, and almost upon the instant a footman burst into the study to say that a window in the small morning-room beyond had been found standing open and unlatched, though the household had been certain it was fastened at dusk. Sir Aldrich rose at once, his composure quite gone. "A window? Good God, is anything disturbed?" We hastened after the footman into the morning-room, where indeed a casement stood ajar, the night air stirring the curtain, and a smear of what might have been garden soil showed faintly upon the sill. Nothing in the room itself appeared to have been touched. Holmes examined the window with care, though he said little, and we returned to the study to find that Sir Aldrich, in his agitation, had gone before us. We found him upon the floor beside the oak cabinet, fallen as a man falls who is struck without warning, one hand still outflung toward the shelf where the deposition had lain. I knelt at once and made such examination as my profession permits, but I need not tell any reader with the smallest medical knowledge that there was nothing to be done. Sir Aldrich Vane was dead, and had been, I judged, no more than 2 or 3 minutes when we found him. "The heart," said I to Holmes, low, as I rose from my knees. "There is no mark of violence that I can find. A man of his age, under sudden strain, "It may be exactly as it appears," said Holmes quietly, "or it may be a great deal more. Touch nothing further, Watson, until Lestrade has seen the room as we see it now." The household was roused in the space of a few dreadful minutes, and I shall not attempt to set down in order the cries, the running footsteps, the white and frightened faces that filled the passage. Lady Vane came down in a dressing gown, and stood in the doorway with a stillness more terrible than any outcry, her eyes fixed not upon her husband's body, but, I could have sworn, upon the empty space within the cabinet where the deposition had lain. Miss Strake arrived close behind her, and it was not the sight of death that shook her composure, but something else. I saw her glance dart to the cabinet and then quickly away, as though she had looked upon a thing she had long dreaded and at last beheld. Inspector Lestrade, summoned by a constable from the square, arrived within the half-hour, brisk, sandy-whiskered, and disposed at once to a comfortable theory. "A shock to the heart, Doctor, brought on by the fright of a burglar at the window. That is plain enough, surely," said he, surveying the room. "You're Mr. Fenwick. Now, the dealer in antiquities. I am told he called here twice this week under pretence of business, and was seen examining that very cabinet with more interest than manners allow. A man of his trade knows the value of old seals and old papers. I should not wonder if we have our thief already half discovered." "You may be entirely right, Lestrade," said Holmes, in a tone I knew well enough to recognise as one of studied neutrality, "and I should not dream of discouraging so promising a line of inquiry. I observe only that the deposition itself has not been stolen. It lies yonder upon the desk where Sir Aldrich left it, but it has certainly been moved since I examined it not 20 minutes since. It lay then beneath the lamp. It lies now 1.5 inches to the left and folded along a different crease." Lestrade frowned at this, but had no ready answer, and busied himself instead with his notebook, and his theory of burglary interrupted. I confess that for my own part, watching the strange assembly of grief and fear about that quiet lamplit room, I found myself less troubled by the manner of Sir Aldrich's death than by the singular fact, which Holmes murmured to me as we at last took our leave in the small hours, that not one person in that household had wept, or cried out, or shown surprise, in any manner that corresponded to the shock before them. Their sorrow, if sorrow it was, seemed fixed upon the paper rather than the man, and it was this more than any mark upon the window or any smear upon the sill that told Holmes, and told me, following his lead as I had followed it for so many years, that we had not come to the end of the matter but only to its threshold. Chapter 4. Altered Paper, Erased Dust, and Careful Words. We returned to the Kensington house upon the following morning, Lestrade having consented, with some reluctance, that Holmes should be permitted a further examination of the study before the household resumed its ordinary business. The room, in the cold light of day, seemed a different chamber altogether from the shadowed scene of the night before. The law reports stood ranked and orderly upon their shelves. The desk had been set to rights by some careful hand, and only the faint disturbance of the rug beside the oak cabinet remained to mark where Sir Aldrich had fallen. Holmes went first to the window of the small morning-room, where he spent a considerable time upon his knees with his lens, examining the sill and the catch, with a patience that would have tried a less experienced observer than myself. "You will recall, Watson, that Lestrade takes this window for the entrance of a thief," said he at length, rising and dusting his knees. "Observe the marks upon the woodwork. They are deliberate, evenly spaced, and made, unless I am much mistaken, with the blade of a pocket-knife rather than any implement a housebreaker would carry for the purpose. A man forcing a window from without leaves marks that slant inward, following the angle of his tool as he works against resistance from below. These marks slant outward. They were made by someone standing inside the room, and made, I should say, with more attention to appearance than to effect." "You mean the window was never forced at all? That someone wished it to appear so?" "I mean precisely that. And here is a further curiosity." He drew me to the cabinet, where the dust upon the lower shelf lay thick and undisturbed save for a single clean rectangle, some 10 inches by 7, as sharply bordered as though drawn with a rule. Something lay here, Watson, and was lifted away entire without disturbing the surrounding dust by so much as a smear. A thief in haste, fumbling in the dark for plunder, does not achieve so neat a theft. This was done slowly, by daylight or by careful lamplight, by a hand that knew exactly what it sought and exactly where to find it. He took up the deposition itself from the desk, where it had lain since the previous evening under Lestrade's instruction that nothing should be removed, and held it once more to the window light, turning it this way and that with his lens close to the wax. "Come and look at this, Watson. You have some knowledge of chemistry from your student days, though I confess your practice of it since has run more to the bedside than the laboratory. What do you make of this seal?" I bent over the disc of red wax, warmed a little by the sunlight through the glass. It appears sound enough to my eye. The impression is clear, a device of some kind, a bird, I think, above a scroll. The impression, yes, but observe the wax itself, apart from the impression it bears. Old wax, Watson, dries and crazes with age in a manner quite distinct from wax freshly softened and reset. This wax shows the fine crackling of years, and yet the impression stamped upon it is crisp to a degree I should expect only in wax pressed within the 12-month. The wax, in short, is old. The impression is not. Someone has taken an aged seal, removed perhaps from another document entire, and pressed it afresh into service here. I confess I found this distinction beyond my own powers of observation, though I did not doubt it once Holmes had pointed the way, as I had learned not to doubt such things across a dozen years of similar demonstrations. It was as he laid the deposition down again that his eye fell upon a sheet of blotting paper lying beside the standish, much used, its surface a palimpsest of reversed and overlapping impressions. He carried it at once to the mirror above the fireplace, and I watched his face sharpen with interest as the reflection rendered a portion of the blotted writing legible. "Here, Watson, read this, if you can, in the glass." I peered at the reflected fragment and made out with some difficulty a broken phrase, "before the child was taken away." Sir Aldrich's own hand? I believe so. A man does not blot another's correspondence upon his private desk. He was writing or drafting something concerning a child and concerning its removal in the last days of his life. You will remember that neither Sir Aldrich nor any member of his household has spoken to us of any child, living or dead, in connection with this matter. We were interrupted at this point by the arrival of Lady Vane, summoned, I think, by the sound of our voices, and appearing paler and more composed than I had yet seen her, as though grief, having spent its first violence in private, had settled now into a kind of watchful calm. "You are examining my husband's papers, Mr. Holmes," said she, not quite a question. "I am endeavouring to understand them, Lady Vane, which is not always the same thing. May I ask whether the name of any child, born perhaps out of wedlock, has ever been mentioned in this house, in connection with the old inquiry your husband once conducted at Hatherby Cross?" Her composure did not break, but I saw her hand find the back of a chair and rest there. "I never saw such a child, Mr. Holmes. I do not know what you can mean." "I didn't ask whether you had seen one," said Holmes gently, "only whether you had heard of one." She made no answer to this, but turned and left the room with a step a shade too deliberate for one merely offended. Lestrade, entering shortly after with the confidence of a man who believes his case already half made, was disposed to treat these discoveries as interesting but subordinate to the plainer facts before him. Sir Aldrich's will was altered not 6 weeks past, Mr. Holmes, and I have it on the solicitor's own word. Mr. Harbury drew it himself, that both Lady Vane and Captain Lydgate benefit very handsomely by the change. Add to that Fenwick's debts, which are considerable, and Miss Strake's freedom of the house at all hours as its secretary, and you have motive enough for 6 murders, without troubling yourself over old wax and blotted ink. "I do not doubt there is motive enough to spare, Inspector," said Holmes, "and that is precisely what troubles me, and when a house offers so rich a harvest of grievance and gain, I find myself asking not who wished Sir Aldrich dead, for it seems half his acquaintance might have wished it on one ground or another, but who wished a document sealed and forgotten for 20 years to remain believed a moment longer than the truth allowed. That, Lestrade, is a narrower question, and I think in the end it will prove the truer one. Chapter 5. Shadows from the Provincial Inquiry. For the better part of 2 days following our discoveries in the study, Holmes was scarcely to be seen at Baker Street save at odd hours, when he would appear briefly to consume a hurried meal, or none at all, before vanishing again upon errands he did not trouble to explain. I had grown accustomed, over the years, to these periods of solitary industry, in which my friend's mind moved along channels of its own devising, and I did not press him for an account of them, knowing from long experience that he would produce one when, and only when, it had assumed a shape worth the telling. It was upon the evening of the second day that he returned in a mood I recognised at once, brisk, bright-eyed, and disposed, for once, to speak. I have been to Somerset House, Watson, and to the offices of a provincial newspaper that has the singular virtue of preserving its back numbers with more diligence than most institutions preserve their principals. I have also exchanged 3 telegrams with a retired clerk of the Wiltshire Assizes, and one with a woman who keeps the parish register at a village called Hatherby Cross, of which you have very properly never heard. And what have you learned? That Sir Aldrich Vane, 22 years ago, presided as a young and rising magistrate over a private inquiry held at Hatherby Cross, concerning the disappearance of an infant born to a young woman of the parish named Marian Vale. The inquiry was conducted with great discretion, as such matters were in those days when a family's name counted for more than a child's welfare, and it concluded upon the strength of a single sworn deposition, the very document, Watson, that has lain sealed in Sir Aldrich's cabinet these 20 years, to the effect that the infant had died of natural causes within its first weeks of life, and Marian Vale herself vanished from the parish within the year, and was never afterward traced by any record I have been able to discover. Her mother had been in service, before her marriage, to the Vale household of that district, a family, I should say, of some standing, though never of great wealth. It is the connection between that family and the household we visited in Kensington that I have spent these 2 days in establishing, and I have not laboured in vain. He drew out his notebook and consulted it, though I suspected the reference was more for my benefit than his own, his memory upon such matters being generally beyond the need of prompting. Miss Eleanor Strake's mother, Watson, was housemaid to the Vale family at the very time of the inquiry, and left their service within a month of Marian Vale's disappearance, under circumstances the parish records describe only as sudden. Miss Strake was herself an infant at the time, and cannot of course have any personal memory of the matter, yet I think we may take it that she did not come to her present situation in Sir Aldrich's household by pure and disinterested chance. You believe she sought the post deliberately? I believe it exceedingly probable. As for Captain Lydgate, his family, his mother's family to be precise, were the very people whose name the inquiry was convened to protect. It was a Lydgate, Watson, or a man closely allied to that family by marriage, who stood as the presumed father of Marian Vale's child, though his name appears nowhere upon the record I have been permitted to see. The inquiry's chief effect, whatever its ostensible purpose, was to close a chapter that might otherwise have cost that family very dear in reputation, and perhaps in fortune. And Harbury? Harbury's connection is closer still, and I confess it is the one that most engages my interest. His late father, Josiah Harbury, served as clerk to the very inquiry over which Sir Aldrich presided. It was the elder Harbury's hand, in all likelihood, that prepared the deposition for the seal, and his hand that filed it afterward among the records of the proceeding. The son has inherited not merely his father's profession, but I strongly suspect some portion of his father's most private knowledge. I sat for some moments turning these facts over in my mind, and found in them a pattern that chilled me more than any tale of simple greed could have done. Then the household we visited, Holmes, is no mere gathering of strangers thrown together by a magistrate's hospitality. It is a reunion of a kind. the children and dependents of those who once played some part, willing or unwilling, in an old and buried wrong. You've put it better than I could myself, Watson. I have long observed that guilt, once concealed, does not perish with the concealment. It sleeps very often for a generation or more and wakens only when some chance disturbs the ground above it. I begin to believe that someone in that household has spent these last weeks disturbing that ground very deliberately, and that Sir Aldrich's death is not the beginning of this matter, but very nearly its end. Then who sent the letter, and why now, after so many years of silence? That, Watson, is the question upon which the whole edifice must finally turn, and I do not yet possess the means of answering it with certainty. I will tell you this much, however. A man or woman who merely wished to avenge an old wrong would have struck at once, or not at all, upon learning the truth. To wait, and then to strike with such particular timing, a letter first, then silence, then sudden and fatal confrontation, argues not the heat of revenge, but the cold calculation of self-preservation. Someone, I think, learned recently that the old deception stood in danger of discovery, and acted not from a desire to punish the past, but from a desperate wish to prevent it from altering the present. He rose and stood for a while at the window looking down upon the lamplit street, his hands clasped behind him, in an attitude I had come to associate with the final ordering of some intricate problem. There is one thing more, Watson, that I have not yet mentioned, and it troubles me more than all the rest. Miss Strake, whose mother left the Vale household under circumstances no one will now explain, has within these last weeks, according to a housemaid I contrived to interview upon a pretext I shall spare you, been asking Sir Aldrich a number of questions concerning the old inquiry, questions he answered with increasing reluctance and toward the end with evident alarm. It was, I think, her curiosity, however innocently intended, that set in motion the train of events which brought us first to that quiet study, and which has since left it a good deal less quiet than either of us could have wished. Chapter 6. The Betrayal Behind the Seal. Holmes determined upon the following morning that the time had come to speak with each member of the Kensington household separately, and it was arranged, through Lestrade's good offices, that we should be permitted the use of the small morning room for that purpose, the study itself being still, in some sense, under the shadow of what had occurred there. I observed that Holmes took no notes during these interviews, relying instead, as was his custom, upon that singular memory of his which seemed to require no aid beyond the attention he gave in the first instance. And I observed further that he asked in each case comparatively few questions, preferring to let silence do the work that a more eager examiner might have attempted with words. Miss Strake came first, composed outwardly, but with a stillness about her that I had learned in these last days to read as the mask of considerable feeling held rigidly in check. "You have been asking Sir Aldrich certain questions of late, Miss Strake," Holmes began without preamble, "concerning an inquiry held many years ago at a village called Hatherby Cross." She did not attempt denial, which I thought spoke well of her, whatever else might be said. "My mother spoke of it upon her deathbed, Mr. Holmes, though I did not understand the half of what she said at the time. She called it a sealed lie, and said that a young woman had been made to vanish so that a family's name might remain unstained. I did not know, until I came into Sir Aldrich's service some years later, quite by chance, I give you my word, that the magistrate of that old inquiry was the very man I now served. And having discovered it, you did not leave his employment. I told myself at first that it was mere coincidence, and later that I owed it to my mother's memory to learn the truth, if truth were to be learned. I asked Sir Aldrich certain questions, framed as idly as I could contrive, concerning old inquiries and old depositions. He answered me kindly enough at first, and then not kindly at all. I believe I frightened him, Mr. Holmes, though that was never my intention. I wished only to know. Did you write him a note some 10 days since containing the words, 'The seal was never yours'?" Her eyes widened with what I took to be genuine astonishment. "I did not, sir. I give you my solemn word I did not." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, and then thanked her and let her go, and I could not, for my own part, determine from his manner whether he believed her or merely reserved his judgment. Captain Lydgate followed, blunt and soldierly in his bearing, though I fancied there was less bluffness in his manner than upon our first meeting. "I'll not pretend ignorance, Mr. Holmes, now that you've evidently gone digging in old parish registers," said he, seating himself with the deliberate ease of a man determined to appear unconcerned. "My mother's people were mixed up in that old business at Hatherby Cross. I was a boy of 6 or 7 at the time, and I'll swear to you I never knew the particulars until I was grown, and then only in whispers that my own family thought it best I should not press too far. The inquiry, whatever passed at it, kept our name out of the mud. I've profited by that silence all my life, Mr. Holmes, without ever asking too closely what purchased it. And Sir Aldrich's recent alteration of his will in your favour? A kindness from an old family friend, nothing more, and one I'd gladly return this moment if it would bring the poor devil back to life. I had no cause to wish him dead, Mr. Holmes, quite the reverse. He was the last man living, so far as I knew, who could have told me the whole truth of that old affair had he ever chosen to. It was Lady Vane, however, whose interview I found most affecting, and I think Holmes found it so likewise, though he showed it less. She came in pale but resolute, and seated herself with the air of a woman who is determined to endure an ordeal rather than postpone it. "My husband had not been himself these last months, Mr. Holmes," said she, before he had well begun his questions. "He took to reviewing his old papers at night, when he thought the house asleep. I found him once, near midnight, with the cabinet open, and that dreadful deposition spread upon the desk before him, weeping. I had never in 11 years of marriage seen him weep, and when I asked him the cause, he said only that a man's reputation is a house built upon sand, and that the tide was coming in at last." "Did he say what tide, Lady Vane?" "He did not, and I did not press him, for I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I had come by then to suspect there was something in his past he could not share even with me, and I had grown afraid of what it might be." She paused, and her composure, held so carefully through the whole of our interview, wavered at last. "I have wondered since, God forgive me, whether he married me in some part to fill a silence that had grown too heavy to bear alone." When she had gone, Holmes sat for some time without speaking, his fingers pressed together before him in that attitude of concentration I knew so well. "We begin to see the shape of the thing, Watson," said he at length, "though not yet its final feature. I am now all but certain that the deposition Sir Aldrich kept under seal these 20 years did not say what he allowed the world to believe it said. I do not think it declared the child dead at all. I think it named the child's true father, and set down some arrangement by which the infant was removed from Hatherby Cross and raised elsewhere, under another name, in exchange for the silence of all concerned. If that is so, then the document in yonder cabinet, which we examined 2 nights since, is not the true deposition, but a substitute, sealed with a wax that once fastened the genuine paper, and set in its place by a hand that understood exactly what it was doing. Then someone, Holmes, deliberately falsified the record of a legal inquiry, and has kept that falsehood alive for 22 years. Precisely so, Watson, and I think you will agree that a man who once dared such a thing, and saw it hold undetected for a generation, would go to very great lengths indeed to prevent its unravelling now, at the 11th hour, when the truth need be hidden but a little longer to remain hidden forever. You believe, then, that Sir Aldrich's death was no accident of a weak heart, but murder in some deeper sense, even if no hand was raised against him? I believe, Watson, that revenge might explain a great deal of anger in that household, but anger alone does not account for the precision with which this matter has been managed. The window contrived to mislead, the dust wiped clean along so exact a line, the seal transferred with a care that argues long familiarity with such work. Someone in that house is not merely aggrieved by the past, someone is still, at this very hour, engaged in protecting it. Chapter 7. The Art Dealer's Convenient Guilt. We had scarcely settled to a late breakfast upon the following morning when a telegram arrived from Lestrade, couched in terms of such evident satisfaction that Holmes read it aloud with a certain dry amusement quite lost, I think, upon its author. "Case as good as closed," he read. "Search of Fenwick's rooms has produced conclusive evidence. Come at once if you wish to see justice done properly for once. You will observe, Watson, that our good inspector has recovered entirely from any doubts my wax and my dust may have planted in his mind." We found Lestrade at the Kensington house in a mood of unmistakable triumph, standing over a small table upon which had been laid out, with the careful arrangement of a man displaying trophies, the contents of a leather travelling case seized from Mr. Giles Fenwick's lodgings that same morning. There was a packet of dark red sealing wax, old in appearance and much handled, a small brass heating lamp of the kind used by dealers and restorers for delicate work upon wax or leather, and a folded paper which proved, upon examination, to be a draft bill of sale for 2 items from Sir Aldrich's collection, including, I noted with some interest, a description of an early provincial seal of antiquarian rather than intrinsic value. "There, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the satisfaction of a man laying down a winning hand at whist. "Motive, means, and opportunity, all in one travelling case. Fenwick had debts. We've confirmed as much with his bankers, and he'd been angling after Sir Aldrich's collection for weeks past, under cover of a legitimate purchase. I say he meant to substitute a forged seal for the genuine article, sell the true one privately to some collector who wouldn't ask too many questions, and was interrupted at his work by Sir Aldrich, whom he frightened into his grave. The window was his means of escape, hastily managed in the dark. Fenwick himself, summoned to account for these discoveries, protested with a vehemence that seemed to me, I confess, very near to genuine, though I had learned enough of criminal investigation in Holmes's company to distrust my own first impressions upon such a point. "I collect old seals and old wax as another man collects snuff-boxes, Inspector, and I'll not deny it," said he, mopping his brow with a large handkerchief. "It is my trade to know such things, and a dealer who cannot authenticate what he sells is no dealer at all, but a fool waiting to be cheated. I had hoped Sir Aldrich might part with 1 or 2 pieces from his collection at a fair price, and I do not scruple to admit that my present circumstances make such a sale more welcome to me than it might once have been. But I never touch that cabinet, Mr. Holmes, and I'll swear it on anything you care to name." "You were observed studying the cabinet with particular attention upon our first visit," Holmes observed, though his tone, I thought, carried less accusation than simple inquiry. "I was admiring the workmanship, sir, and wondering, as any dealer must, what such pieces might fetch. Is a man to be hanged for the habits of his profession?" Lestrade, undeterred by these protestations, proceeded to reconstruct his theory before us with evident relish, tracing a narrative in which Fenwick, admitted to the study upon some pretext of examining the collection, had set about his substitution with lamp and wax, been surprised by Sir Aldrich's unexpected return, and had fled through the window in the small morning room, leaving the shock of discovery to do its fatal work upon an old man's heart. "It is a coherent theory, Lestrade," said Holmes, "and I will own that it accounts for a very great deal. I wonder, however, whether you would permit me a few minutes with this sealing wax before you commit yourself entirely to it." Lestrade, confident enough in his case to indulge what he plainly regarded as an old friend's harmless eccentricity, consented, and Holmes, producing from his own bag a small spirit lamp and a fragment broken from the seal upon the deposition itself, preserved, I now realized from our examination 2 nights before, proceeded to melt a portion of each wax in turn, timing the process with his watch and noting the temperature at which each began to soften. You will observe, Lestrade, that the wax from Mr. Fenwick's case liquefies at a temperature some 15 degrees lower than the wax upon the deposition. They are not of the same manufacture, nor, I should judge, of anything near the same age. The deposition seal was fixed with a wax compounded, if I am not mistaken, some 40 or 50 years since, of a formula long out of common use. Mr. Fenwick's wax, whatever his intentions in carrying it, is of recent and quite ordinary manufacture, such as any stationer might supply. That proves only that he had not yet purchased wax to match, Lestrade objected, though with rather less conviction than before. It proves at the least that he could not have effected the substitution we discovered upon the deposition, using the materials found in his possession. I would draw your attention further to the lamp itself. A tool of this kind, put to recent and delicate use, shows characteristic traces about the wick and the reservoir, a slight fouling, a residue of the very wax it has lately melted. This lamp is clean, Lestrade, clean as though it had not been lit in some weeks, if not longer. The evidence against Mr. Fenwick is, I grant you, considerable in appearance. I begin to suspect it is considerable chiefly because it was intended to appear so. Lestrade's face, which had worn throughout this demonstration an expression of gradually diminishing confidence, now settled into a frown of genuine perplexity. You mean the case was planted upon him, Mr. Holmes? I mean that I should like to know who had both the opportunity to place such a case among Mr. Fenwick's effects, and the knowledge to select articles so plausible in their guilt, and I think, Inspector, that the answer to that question will carry us a good deal further than the answer to who profits by Sir Aldrich's will. I watched, during the remainder of that interview, the countenances of those still gathered in the house. Miss Drake pale and silent by the window, Captain Lydgate frowning into the middle distance, Lady Vane very still upon the sofa, and I could not but feel that somewhere among that quiet, watchful company sat the very hand that had furnished Lestrade with his neat and convenient parcel of guilt, and that Holmes, in demonstrating Fenwick's probable innocence, had done nothing so much as draw that hidden hand one step nearer to the light. Chapter 8. The phrase that broke the lie. Holmes was unusually quiet as we drove back to Baker Street that afternoon, and I knew better than to interrupt a silence that I had learned, over many years, to recognise as the final and most delicate stage of construction, in an edifice of reasoning nearly, but not quite, complete. It was not until we had dined and he had settled into his chair with his pipe that he spoke of the case again, and then it was to ask me a question rather than to offer any conclusion. Watson, when a man repeats a sentence he has read but once, upon a scrap of paper shown him only for a moment, what alteration would you expect in his repetition, supposing him entirely innocent of any part in its composition? None at all, I should think, beyond some trifling error of memory, a word misplaced perhaps, or a phrase shortened. Precisely so. An innocent man handles another's words carelessly, because they carry for him no particular weight beyond their surface meaning. A guilty man, Watson, or one who knows more of a sentence's history than he cares to admit, will very often alter it in some small but significant particular, without the least awareness that he has done so, because his mind supplies, unbidden, the version that lives in his own private knowledge rather than the version set down upon the paper before him. I propose, tomorrow, to test our friends at Kensington upon exactly this point. The following morning found us once more in the now familiar study, the household assembled at Holmes's request, under the mild pretext that he wished to clarify certain small matters before making his report to Lestrade. He produced the original anonymous letter, held it before each person in turn for the space of perhaps 10 seconds, then withdrew it, and asked that they repeat, as nearly as memory served, the sentence it contained. Lady Vane, when her turn came, repeated the words correctly, though her voice shook upon them. The seal was never yours. Captain Lydgate did the same, with the blunt indifference of a man reciting an order he did not fully understand. Miss Drake likewise gave the sentence without alteration, though I saw her hands clasped very tightly in her lap as she did so. It was Harbury, standing a little apart near the window, who hesitated when his turn arrived, and then said, in a voice pitched carefully low, the seal was never his. Holmes said nothing for a moment, and I confess I did not myself grasp the significance of so small a substitution, until I saw Lady Vane's face change. A swift, involuntary flinch, gone almost before it appeared, yet unmistakable to one who had learned, as I had, to watch for such things in Holmes's company. "You have altered the pronoun, Mr. Harbury," said Holmes quietly. "The letter says yours. You have twice now, in speaking of it, said his." "A trifling slip of memory, surely," said Harbury, though the colour had gone from his face. "One word is very like another in such matters." "One word is never very like another, Mr. Harbury, to the mind that has composed the sentence rather than merely read it. A man who wrote, 'The seal was never his,' referring, let us say, to some third party in his own thoughts, and who afterward altered the pronoun to yours for the purpose of addressing Sir Aldrich directly, might very naturally revert to his original phrasing when off his guard, and speaking as he believes only of the letter's substance rather than its precise wording." Harbury opened his mouth to protest further, but Holmes had already turned from him to the desk, where the deposition itself, restored to the household's keeping though still under Lestrade's watchful eye, lay beneath a stronger lamp than any we had yet employed upon it. He bent over it now with his lens, working with a patience that held the whole room silent, until at last he straightened and beckoned me to his side. "Look here, Watson, beneath the seal itself, where the wax meets the paper. Do you observe the faint circular mark, paler than the surrounding surface, extending perhaps a quarter-inch beyond the wax on every side?" I looked closely, and made out, with some effort, a very faint discoloration in the paper's texture, a ghost of a circle somewhat larger than the wax disc it now surrounded. "That, Watson, is the mark left by an earlier seal, of slightly greater diameter than the one now affixed, which rested upon this same spot for some years before it was removed. Paper takes an impression from long pressure and slow chemical action, quite as surely as it takes ink from a pen, though far less obviously, and this discoloration could not have been produced by the wax presently upon the document, which is, as we know, of an age and manufacture inconsistent with recent use in any dishonest purpose. The seal we see today was not newly forged, Lestrade. It is old, genuine in itself, and taken from some other paper entire, then transferred to this one with very great care." Lestrade, who had arrived in time to hear the latter part of this demonstration, frowned heavily. "Then Fenwick could not have accomplished this, Inspector, whatever his intentions towards Sir Aldrich's collection may have been. A deception of this kind was not begun last week, nor last month, but a great many years since, by someone with the knowledge and the skill to lift an old seal entire from its original resting place, and set it, undamaged, upon a substitute. I would ask you to consider, further, the window in the morning room which I examined again this morning. The marks I showed you before, made from within rather than without, have this virtue. They could only have been produced after Sir Aldrich's death, by someone still in the house, wishing the household and the police to believe that a stranger had entered and departed by that route. The crime scene, Lestrade, was not the work of a thief surprised at his labour. It was staged calmly and deliberately by someone who wished your attention drawn toward burglary and away from an older and more private history. Then who, Lestrade began, but Holmes raised a hand. I believe I can now answer that question with confidence, Inspector, but I should prefer to do so before the whole household assembled, rather than piecemeal in this fashion. Will you permit me to gather them here this evening? I have set down, in the course of my association with Sherlock Holmes, a great many moments in which the pattern of some dark and tangled business resolved itself, before my eyes, into a shape both simple and terrible. But I do not think I have often felt, as I felt that afternoon watching Percival Harbury's carefully composed face, so complete a certainty that we stood at last upon the very threshold of the truth, and that its revelation, when it came, would bring with it no triumph, but only a kind of sorrow proper to the uncovering of an old and long-buried grief. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the culprit. The household assembled that evening in Sir Aldrich's study wore, each in their several ways, the aspect of persons awaiting a verdict rather than a mere conclusion to an inquiry. Lady Vane sat apart near the cold hearth, her hands folded with a stillness that seemed to cost her some effort. Miss Strake occupied a straight-backed chair near the door as though prepared, even now, for some sudden summons away. Captain Lydgate stood rather than sat, his soldier's frame held stiffly, his eyes moving from face to face with an unease he did not trouble to disguise. Mr. Fenwick, released that afternoon from the cloud of Lestrade's suspicion, had been asked to attend also, and sat somewhat apart, an aggrieved but curious spectator to a drama from which he now knew himself excluded. Lestrade stood near the door with the particular alertness of an officer who suspects, without yet fully understanding, that the ground beneath his case has shifted. Mr. Percival Harbury arrived last of all, composed, correct, his mourning band immaculate, and took the chair Holmes indicated with the unhurried dignity of a solicitor attending a reading of the will rather than a man walking toward his own exposure. Holmes stood before the cold hearth and began, as was his custom upon such occasions, not with accusation, but with narrative. "I must ask you all to travel with me for a few minutes to a village called Hatherby Cross, 22 years ago," said he. "A young woman of that parish, Marian Vale, bore a child out of wedlock, the father being a man of some standing whose family had every reason to wish the matter kept private. A private inquiry was convened, presided over by a young and promising magistrate named Aldrich Vane, and it concluded, upon the strength of a single sworn deposition, that the infant had died in its first weeks of life. Marian Vale left the parish soon afterward, and was never again traced by any record." He paused, and I saw Miss Strake's hands tighten in her lap. That deposition, ladies and gentlemen, did not say what the world was permitted to believe it said. It did not declare the child dead. It named the child's father, and it set down, in careful and deliberate language, an arrangement by which the infant was removed from Hatherby Cross while yet living, and placed elsewhere, under another name, in exchange for a silence that would protect every party concerned, the father's family, the mother's reputation as it might have been salvaged, and not least the reputation of the young magistrate who accepted so convenient a resolution to so awkward an inquiry. "You cannot know this, sir," Harbury interposed, his voice even, though I fancied a note beneath its evenness that had not been there before. "I know it, Mr. Harbury, because the true deposition still exists, and I have seen it. It came into my possession only this afternoon, from among certain papers your late father left at his death, and which have lain, I think, undisturbed in your own office since that time, though not perhaps unread by you." The room had gone very still. Harbury said nothing. "Your father, sir, was clerk to that inquiry 22 years ago. It was his hand that prepared the original deposition for Sir Aldrich's seal, and it was his hand, I believe, that later prepared a second and false deposition, declaring the child's death, to stand in the record where the true document had lain. The genuine seal, old, and bearing an impression your father would have recognised at a glance, was lifted with great care from the true paper and set upon the false one, so that no examination of the seal alone could ever betray the substitution. Sir Aldrich, whether from complicity or from a magistrate's convenient willingness to accept the paper that closed his inquiry most tidily, allowed the false deposition to stand, and built upon its foundation 25 years of unblemished reputation. "And if this were all true," said Harbury, his composure beginning at last to fray at its edges, "what has it to do with me? I was a child myself when these events took place." "You were, Mr. Harbury, but you are a man now, and a man who inherited, along with your father's practice, a private knowledge that your entire professional standing, built as it was upon your father's reputation for legal integrity, could not survive should it become known. I believe you discovered the truth among your father's papers some months since. I believe further that Sir Aldrich in these last weeks had begun himself to review his old collection, with a conscience grown heavier than it had once been, and that Miss Strake's innocent questions arising from her own mother's dying words had quickened in him a fear that the truth might, after so long a silence, at last find its way to light. "He meant to confess," said Lady Vane suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness like a dropped glass. "He told me as much, though not the whole of it. He said he could no longer carry the weight alone." "Just so, Lady Vane, and it was that intention, communicated, I believe, to Mr. Harbury in his capacity as solicitor and confidant, that placed Mr. Harbury in a position from which he saw no escape save one. He sent the anonymous letter first, hoping perhaps to frighten Sir Aldrich into silence without the necessity of open confrontation. When that failed, and Sir Aldrich persisted in his resolve to reveal the truth, a resolve that would have exposed not only his own old complicity, but the elder Harbury's forgery, and with it the son's inherited disgrace, Mr. Harbury came to this house and confronted him in this very room. This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes. Nothing more, said Harbury, but his voice had lost the last of its steadiness. It is conjecture supported by the ink upon your cuff at our first meeting, violet and cheap, such as is found in public writing-rooms, where a careful man might compose an anonymous letter without risk of its being traced to his own inkstand. It is supported by your persistent avoidance of the word deposition in that same interview, and by your alteration, quite unconscious I am sure, of the letter's pronoun from yours to his, betraying a mind that had composed the sentence with a third party in view before ever addressing it to Sir Aldrich. It is supported by the seal itself, which required a hand trained, as yours was by your father, in the delicate handling of such instruments, and it is supported, finally, by the staged disorder of that window, and the false trail of guilt so carefully assembled and laid at Mr. Fenwick's door. A trail that only someone with knowledge of Mr. Fenwick's financial difficulties and access enough to place such materials among his effects could have contrived. Harbury sat very still for a long moment, and when at last he spoke, it was in a voice from which all pretence had finally drained away. He would have destroyed everything my father built, Mr. Holmes, everything I built upon it. I did not go to that study meaning him harm. I went only to plead with him, one last time, for silence. But he would not be moved, and when I told him, when I let him see that I knew, that I had always known, he went white and clutched at his chest and fell before ever I could reach him. I did not strike him, Mr. Holmes. I swear before God I did not strike him. But I confess I did not stay to save him either. I saw only that the truth had died with him, or so I believed, and I set about ensuring that it would remain dead. Lestrade, recovering himself, stepped forward at last to do his duty, and the room dissolved into that quiet, terrible bustle which follows always upon such revelations, a bustle in which grief, relief, and a kind of exhausted stillness mingled upon every face, and in which I, watching Holmes stand silent and grave before the cold hearth, understood that no triumph attended this particular unravelling, but only the sorrowful satisfaction of a truth restored, however late, to its rightful place. Chapter 10. Watson's reflection on memory and consequence. Percival Harbury was arrested that same evening, though not, as Lestrade was at pains to explain to his superiors, upon a charge of murder in the conventional sense, there being no mark of violence upon Sir Aldrich's person, and no medical evidence, as I could myself attest, of anything beyond a heart that had simply ceased, under the strain of a terrible hour, to perform its office. The charges that followed concerned themselves rather with conspiracy, with the obstruction of justice, and with Harbury's own active part in suppressing and disguising evidence connected to a fraud 22 years old. A fraud, moreover, in which his own father's hand, could the law have reached so far into the past, might have stood equally condemned. The original memorandum, that true and long-suppressed deposition which Holmes had recovered from among the elder Harbury's private papers, was placed in evidence, and I understand that it will in time restore, so far as any legal process now can, some portion of the truth to the record from which it had been so carefully excised. I called upon Miss Strake some days later, at Holmes's suggestion, in my capacity as a friend of the family rather than a physician, for I had thought her, upon our last meeting, in need of some steadier counsel than the turmoil of that household could then supply. I found her calmer than I had expected, though grave. My mother was not mad then, nor bitter without cause, as my father always believed, said she, when I had told her, as gently as I could, the substance of what Holmes had uncovered. She spoke the truth upon her deathbed, and no one believed her, least of all myself until now. I think I shall find some comfort in that, doctor, though it has cost a man his life and another his liberty to purchase it. Captain Lydgate, I am told, has withdrawn a good deal from the society in which he formerly moved, the connection between his mother's family and the events at Hatherby Cross having become, in the wake of Harbury's trial, a matter of some public curiosity, however discreetly the newspapers of that respectable class contrived to hint at it. He bears, I believe, no legal guilt whatever in the affair, but I have observed, in the course of a long friendship with Holmes, that the stain of an old family secret once brought into the light settles upon the innocent almost as heavily as upon the guilty, though by no just measure of desert. Mr. Fenwick, restored entirely to liberty and to reputation, called upon us at Baker Street to express, in his florid and voluble manner, a gratitude that Holmes bore with more patience than I should myself have commanded. "You have saved me from the gallows, sir, or as near it as makes no matter," said he, wringing Holmes's hand with a warmth that seemed to embarrass my friend considerably more than any accusation had done. "I shall recommend your services, Mr. Holmes, to every man of my acquaintance who finds himself unjustly suspected, though I confess I hope the occasion may not arise too often." Lady Vane I saw but once more, upon a chance meeting in the streets some weeks after the trial's conclusion, dressed still in the black of a widowhood that seemed to sit upon her, I thought, with a certain quiet relief mingled with its sorrow. "He carried it a long time, Dr. Watson," said she. "Longer, I think, than any man should be asked to carry such a weight alone. I do not excuse what he did in accepting that false paper so many years ago, but I have come to understand, since his death, that a young man's ambition and an old man's fear of exposure are, in the end, closer cousins than we like to admit." She pressed my hand and passed on, and I did not see her again. As for Inspector Lestrade, he called at Baker Street some evenings later, ostensibly to report the final disposition of certain minor matters connected with the case, but in truth, I believe, to offer Holmes an acknowledgment that cost him a visible effort of candour. "I'll own the simplest motive isn't always the truest one, Mr. Holmes," said he, turning his hat about in his hands with the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to admitting error. "I had my case built solid enough against Fenwick, or thought I had, and it would have hanged an innocent man's reputation, if not his neck, had you let it stand." "You built upon the evidence before you, Lestrade, which is all any honest officer can do," Holmes replied, with a graciousness I thought did him credit. The evidence in this case had been arranged with unusual skill by a hand that understood precisely what conclusions a busy man, pressed for a swift result, would be inclined to draw from it. I do not think you erred in your reasoning so much as in your data, and a detective, official or otherwise, can rarely be blamed for a lie told convincingly enough. Lestrade seemed to find some comfort in this distinction, and took his leave in better spirits than he had arrived, while I sat by the fire turning over, in my own slower fashion, the whole strange history that had unfolded before us. "It is a curious feature of this case, Holmes," said I, when we were alone again, "that no single act of violence lay at its heart, and yet I do not think I have followed you through a darker business. There was no knife, no pistol, no poison, only a paper, and a lie sealed within it, and the slow work of 22 years. That, Watson, is very often the truest form of crime, and the hardest to bring to justice, for it wears, across so long a span of years, the appearance of settled and respectable fact. A murder is discovered in a night. A fraud of this kind may sleep a generation, waking only when some innocent hand, a daughter's curiosity, a widow's grief, an old man's failing conscience, disturbs the ground above it. I have long believed that the past is never so safely buried as the living suppose, particularly when a lie has been sealed in its place with all the ceremony of truth. A document may rest 20 years in a locked cabinet, Watson, but guilt, I find, remains obstinately awake in every hand that ever touched it. The spring had come on fully by then, and as I sat that evening watching the lamplight fall across Baker Street, softened by a mild and hopeful dusk, quite unlike the raw March evening on which Percival Harbury had first climbed our stair with his rehearsed ignorance and his stained cuff, I found myself reflecting, not for the first time, upon the singular quality of my friend's genius, that he could read, in a smear of violet ink or a misplaced pronoun, the whole slow architecture of a wrong-built, patiently across a generation, and bring it, however sorrowfully, into the light where old wounds might at last, if never wholly healed, be honestly acknowledged.